Earl Mitchell grew up in a world where the soil was more than a backdrop. It was a living history. 50 years later, the same soil holds the weight of a lifetime spent watching seasons turn and communities change. The opening chapter of this story is not about action so much as it is about context. Before the plows, before the combines, before the near misses and the moments of grace, there was a boy who understood that the land gave and the land took. These initial pages need to set the stage for a story about resilience and identity, a story that unfolds on the rolling fields of Iowa and resonates far beyond state lines. This is not the story of a modern superhero. It is the story of an ordinary man carrying extraordinary responsibility at a time when the future of family farming is uncertain. It begins at dawn on a late spring morning, when the light is low and the dew is heavy, and the world is quiet in a way that feels timeless. In Earl's memory, these mornings stretch back across decades like a string of moments threaded together. He remembers the smell of fresh earth turned by his father's old plow, the sound of birds waking in the barn rafters, and the simple pleasure of sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee as the mist lifts from the fields. Before there were bank loans and government programs and commodity markets to worry about, there was this: a man and his land, connected through sweat and intent, bound by a promise that could never be written, but was understood in every calloused hand that touched the soil. Earl's father taught him early on that the farm is not just property, it is a legacy and a responsibility. He remembers being told that hard work would not always be enough, that there would be forces beyond his control, weather, prices, policy. Yet he must show up each morning with the same determination. Those words, spoken in a quiet kitchen over eggs and bacon, would echo in his mind across the years. When he reflects on them now, he can see how they shaped his entire life. The lesson was not that the world owed him a living. The lesson was that the land was sacred because generations had poured their lives into it, and those lives must be honored by continuing. The first chapter of any story needs a hook, and for this one, it is the question of what holds a person to a place when everything else is changing. Earl's peers have retired, sold their farms, or moved to town. His children have gone to cities, pursuing careers that do not depend on weather forecasts or commodity reports. Yet Earl stays. Why? He answers without words, because words cannot capture the pull of the soil, the satisfaction of planting seeds and seeing them grow, the humbling experience of watching a combine fill with grain that will feed families he will never meet. It is a calling, a duty, and, at times, an act of faith. At 68, he is not the stereotypical picture of an aging farmer clinging to the past. His mind is sharp, his hands strong, and his movements reflect decades of efficiency honed by necessity. The lines on his face are not just the product of sun and wind. They are a map of choices made and sacrifices offered. When he steps into the fields, he does not just walk. He carries with him the weight of stories. The droughts of the 1980s, the market crash that threatened his family's farm, the years when corn prices barely covered expenses, and the seasons of abundance when the harvest seemed like a reward for every hardship endured. These stories are not told in whispers around a table. They are woven into his daily routines. The land where Earl lives is typical of the Midwest: gentle hills, rich loam, rows that stretch to the horizon. There is a barn painted red decades ago, faded now, but sturdy. There is a farmhouse that has been added onto over the years, its kitchen big enough to feed hired hands during harvest, its living room filled with photographs and wooden frames that show faces from past and present. Out back are fields of corn and soybeans, depending on rotation, as well as a small pasture where cattle graze. There are hedgerows, fences, an old windmill that no longer functions but remains as a landmark. For those who have never lived on a farm, these details might seem quaint or nostalgic. For Earl, they are the tangible evidence of a life defined by cycles, He knows every section of his land intimately. He knows where the soil is heavy with clay and where it drains well. He knows which field is likely to flood in a heavy rain and which will hold moisture during a dry spell. He can tell you the yield from each plot over the last 30 years without looking at a spreadsheet. This knowledge is not found in books. It is learned through years of walking, planting, watching, and adjusting. It is a form of expertise that is underappreciated in a world that values technology and data. Yet it is this knowledge that has allowed Earl to survive on a family farm when so many others have not. As he stands on his porch on this spring morning, Earl is aware that he is part of a story that is larger than himself. He thinks about the people who will watch this video on their screens, perhaps in cities or suburbs, far removed from the reality of farming. He wonders if they understand the connection between the food on their tables and the soil under his boots. He hopes that by sharing his story, he can bridge that gap, if only for a few minutes. He wants them to understand that behind every bushel of corn or pound of beef, there is a person who has worked in partnership with the land. There is a person who has taken on debt, risked everything, and continued to believe that the work is worth it. If you are watching this from a city apartment or a suburban house, if you have never walked a field at sunrise or felt the earth crumble between your fingers, think about what connects us. Food does not come from supermarkets. It comes from places like Earl's farm. It comes from people who will never meet the people who consume what they produce, but are bound to them by a chain of dependency that is both fragile and powerful. In these early moments of the story, that connection is central. It sets the stakes for everything that follows. The land is not just a plot of acreage. It is the foundation of community and nation. It is all Earl has left, and it is, in many ways, all any of us have left if we care about where our sustenance originates. The first chapter closes by inviting you into the rhythm of a life that is both simple and complex. It is simple because the tasks are straightforward. Plant, tend, harvest, repeat. It is complex because every year brings new variables, weather patterns, market fluctuations, technological advancements, policy changes. To be a farmer is to be a forecaster, a mechanic, a business manager, a botanist, and perhaps most importantly, a steward. Earl does not own the land in the way one owns an object. He is its caretaker for a time, holding it in trust for those who will come after. That perspective changes everything. It turns ordinary work into a form of worship and transforms an old farmhouse into a temple of perseverance and hope. The rest of this story will take you deeper into the life of a man who personifies resilience. Before we move on, take a moment to consider your own connection to the land, no matter where you live. Welcome to the journey. The second chapter of this story opens with memories of youth. When Earl Mitchell was a boy, the farm seemed endless. Cornfields stretched like green oceans, and each hill was a mountain. Back then, the world was small enough that the boundaries of the property defined his universe. His father taught him how to drive a tractor long before he was legally allowed to drive a car on the road. His mother taught him that farming was not just about the crops. It was about feeding the family, taking care of neighbors, and making sure nothing went to waste. Those early lessons shaped him in ways he did not fully understand until much later. Growing up on a farm meant that play and work were interwoven. There were no separate spheres where leisure existed without responsibility. The cows needed to be brought in. That took precedence over a baseball game. If a storm was coming, the family would be out in the field securing equipment and checking fences. Earl remembers waking up early, not because he wanted to, but because that was the expectation. He remembers falling asleep at the dinner table in the middle of harvest season because exhaustion had caught up with him. He remembers being proud when his father trusted him with tasks that adults would normally handle. Each small moment added layers to his identity, connecting him to the lineage of those who had worked the land before him. It is easy to romanticize childhood on a farm, to paint a picture of children running through tall corn, catching fireflies, and feeding animals in barns scented with hay. Those moments existed, but they were part of a mosaic that also included fear and failure and injury. Earl once fell from the loft of the barn and broke his arm. He learned then that a mistake on the farm could have lasting consequences. He saw neighbors lose entire crops to hailstorms that shredded leaves and snapped stalks in minutes. He saw a barn burn when lightning struck during a summer storm. Those incidents seared into his memory a respect for nature's power and a humility about his place in the natural order. The land could be generous, but it could also be harsh. During his teenage years, Earl experienced the first indications that the life he knew would not remain static. The 1970s brought changes to the farm economy. There were booms and busts, and each one left its mark. Earl watched as larger operations emerged, buying up smaller farms in a wave of consolidation. He watched as the cost of machinery climbed, requiring more debt to stay competitive. His father explained that economies of scale were becoming necessary, but he also insisted that quality mattered more than size. Earl remembers the tension between those two ideas, growing to survive in a market that favored big players while maintaining the integrity of practices that had sustained his family for generations. School was a place where Earl encountered perspectives beyond the farm. In science class, he learned about the biology of plants and the chemistry of soil. In history, he heard about wars and inventions and social movements that had shaped the nation. Yet even at a young age, he understood that the knowledge taught in textbooks needed to be translated into practical application on the farm. He would read about photosynthesis and then go home to watch his father examine leaves, checking for signs of disease or nutrient deficiency. He would learn about the Great Depression and then ask his grandfather how the family had survived those years. This integration of academic learning and lived experience gave him a balanced view of agriculture as both science and art. The 1980s were a crucible for farmers across America, and Earl's family was no exception. A combination of high interest rates, falling commodity prices, and increased global competition led to what would later be called the farm crisis. Earl had just taken on more responsibility on the farm when the economy turned. He remembers nights when his parents sat at the kitchen table with stacks of bills and worried looks. He remembers the day an auction was held down the road when a neighbor could no longer make payments. He remembers the calloused hands of that neighbor shaking when he said goodbye to the land he had tended for decades. Those images never left him. They served as warnings about how quickly the foundation of a life could crumble if the balance sheet turned against you. Despite the crisis, Earl's family managed to hold on. They did it through frugality, cooperation, and a willingness to innovate. Earl learned to repair equipment rather than replace it. He learned to negotiate with lenders and keep meticulous records. He learned to diversify crops and consider alternative revenue streams. These skills would become essential in the decades that followed. They also ingrained in him a sense of caution. Never again would he take good years for granted. Every decision would be weighed against a memory of what could happen when markets shifted. The family had survived, but the scars remained, leaving behind a quiet determination to never be forced off the land. One of the most profound influences in Earl's life during these formative years was his father's unwavering sense of integrity. The older man believed that a person's word was binding. If he shook on a deal, he honored it, even if conditions later changed and the deal became disadvantageous. He paid his workers fairly and expected them to work hard in return. When he borrowed money, he paid it back on time. These principles were not just moral abstractions. They were practical strategies for building relationships in a community where reputation mattered. Earl observed that integrity created trust, and trust created resilience. It was easier to weather a bad year if the banker believed you were honest and the neighbors knew you would help them when they needed it. Faith was another pillar in the Mitchell household. They attended church on Sundays, not out of obligation, but because it provided a sense of community and purpose. Earl learned early that his life was not solely his own, it was part of a larger tapestry. When the farm crisis hit, and when personal tragedies struck later, that faith provided a framework for understanding suffering and for finding hope when circumstances felt hopeless. It also reinforced the idea that the land was a gift, not a possession. To mistreat it would be to squander what had been entrusted to them. To care for it was an act of gratitude. In recalling these years, Earl does not paint himself as a hero. He recognizes that he made mistakes, took risks that did not pay off, and sometimes allowed pride to cloud his judgment. He remembers a year when he planted a new hybrid variety of corn that promised higher yields, only to watch it succumb to an unexpected disease. He recalls arguing with his father about whether to adopt no-till practices, convinced that new methods would save labor and protect soil, only to realize later that older practices had value he had not appreciated. Each misstep became a lesson. Each success reinforced a principle. Together, they formed the foundation upon which he would build the rest of his life. By the end of this chapter, the reader should have a sense of the formative influences that shaped Earl into the man he would become. The farm is no longer just a setting. It is a character in its own right, shaping and being shaped by those who live on it. The farm crisis of the 1980s is not just history. It is an experience that still informs decisions decades later. Integrity, faith, work ethic, community. These are not just abstract values. They are the tools and materials with which a life is constructed. Earl's story is rooted in these early years, and understanding them is essential to understanding why he remains on the land when many others have left. The next chapter will explore how the pressures of adulthood tested these values, and how the land became a refuge and a burden at the same time. Adulthood on a farm is often a series of negotiations between tradition and adaptation. When Earl reached his 30s, his role shifted from helper to decision-maker. The responsibilities that had once been shared with his father began to rest more heavily on his own shoulders. He married, started a family, and took out loans to buy new equipment. These were exciting times, full of promise, but they were also fraught with risk. Each decision carried financial and emotional weight. A miscalculation could mean more than a bad year. It could mean the loss of the farm that had been in the family for generations. The early years of Earl's marriage were marked by a sense of partnership. His wife, who had grown up in a nearby town, embraced farm life with enthusiasm. She managed the household, helped with bookkeeping, and learned to operate machinery when necessary. Together, they navigated the challenges of parenting while running a farm. Their children played in the same fields where Earl had played, but they also grew up in an era when opportunities outside agriculture were expanding. Earl wanted them to have choices, even if part of him hoped they would choose to stay. As the 1990s progressed, the agricultural landscape continued to evolve. Biotechnology introduced genetically modified crops, offering higher yields and resistance to pests. Precision agriculture emerged, using satellite imagery and sensors to optimize planting and fertilizing. These innovations promised efficiency and profitability, but also came with costs and controversies. Earl approached each new development with cautious curiosity. He embraced some, like soil testing and yield mapping, because they aligned with his belief in stewardship. He hesitated with others, wary of becoming too dependent on corporate seed suppliers or technologies that might be obsolete in a few years. The balance between staying competitive and staying true to his principles was delicate. During this period, Earl also became more involved in community leadership. He joined the board of the local cooperative, where farmers pooled resources to buy inputs and market grain. He participated in meetings about conservation practices, sharing his experience with younger farmers and learning from experts about soil health and water management. He testified at county hearings when new regulations threatened to impose burdens on small farms. Through these activities, he discovered that resilience was not just an individual trait, it was collective. A farm might survive alone, but a farming community thrived when people collaborated. It was also in his 30s and 40s that Earl faced personal losses that would test his faith and resolve. One year, a late frost killed much of the early planted corn. Another year, a severe drought reduced yields by half. These climatic events were reminders that even with technology and planning, the forces of nature remained beyond human control. More devastating, however, was the death of Earl's father. The older man had been both a mentor and a partner. His passing left a void on the farm and in the family. Earl found himself navigating grief while needing to make decisions about planting, financing, and harvesting. The rituals of farming continued, even as the heart of the farm had stopped beating. Grief can either paralyze or propel. For Earl, it initially did both. There were days when he stood in a field and felt nothing but emptiness. There were nights when the stillness of the farmhouse seemed unbearable. Yet there were also moments when the act of working the soil, of feeling the earth under his boots and the sun on his back, provided solace. Farming became a form of therapy, a way to channel sadness into productive action. Over time, grief transformed into gratitude. Each row planted was an homage to his father. Each harvest was a continuation of a legacy. The land itself seemed to absorb his tears and return them as resilience. The marriage that had once been a source of strength began to strain under the weight of cumulative pressures. Financial stress, unpredictable weather, and the demands of raising children took their toll. There were arguments about decisions large and small. Should they expand the herd of cattle? Should they refinance the mortgage? Should they encourage their eldest son to study agriculture or to pursue his own path? These disagreements were not unique to them. Farm families across the country grappled with similar questions. But in Earl's case, they culminated in a mutual decision to reevaluate priorities. After years of trying to make the relationship work under the constant pressures of farming, Earl and his wife separated. The end of a marriage is never simple, and on a farm it is complicated by the fact that the farm is both a home and a business. Dividing assets meant dividing fields and equipment. Negotiating terms meant balancing fairness with the recognition that the land could not be simply split. Earl found himself facing one of the most difficult negotiations of his life, one that was as emotional as it was financial. He wanted to preserve the farm, but he also wanted to be fair. After months of discussions, they reached an agreement that allowed him to keep the land while providing his wife with the resources she needed to start anew. It was a compromise that hurt but did not destroy. The children, now teenagers, responded to the separation in different ways. The eldest, a daughter, pursued a degree in environmental science. She had always been fascinated by the interplay between agriculture and ecology, and she saw her future in research rather than farming. The younger, a son, enjoyed mechanical work more than field work. He spent hours in the shop tinkering with engines and welding broken parts. Earl encouraged both of them to follow their interests, even as he secretly hoped his son might take over the farm one day. He knew, however, that the future of farming was uncertain. He did not want his children to feel obligated to continue simply because of tradition. In the years following the separation, Earl discovered a deeper sense of individuality. He was still part of a community, still tied to family, but he was also navigating life as a single man. The routines of the farm provided structure, but there was also loneliness. He would come in from the fields to an empty house, cook simple meals, and sit at the kitchen table with only the hum of the refrigerator for company. He missed the sound of laughter, the presence of another person in the bed, the shared moments of triumph and frustration. Yet he also appreciated the clarity that solitude brought. Without someone else's needs to consider, he found it easier to reflect on his own values and goals. As the new century began, Earl faced a different kind of challenge: the growing dominance of corporate agriculture. Multinational companies were buying up land, controlling seed patents, and influencing policy. Small and medium farms like Earl's felt squeezed. On one side were large operations that could produce at lower cost per unit because of economies of scale. On the other side were niche markets focused on organic and specialty crops that required certifications and marketing strategies he had not mastered. Earl was too big to compete in the niche markets and too small to compete with corporate farms. This middle ground was precarious. He responded by focusing on what he could control. He maintained his equipment meticulously to avoid costly breakdowns. He diversified his operation, adding hay and sorghum to his rotation. He invested in conservation practices that reduced erosion and improved soil health. He signed up for government programs that incentivized cover crops, not because he wanted a handout, but because he believed in sustainable practices and recognized that these programs could help stabilize his income. Most importantly, he fostered relationships with local buyers and cooperatives. He knew he could not compete on price alone, but he could compete on quality and reliability. Community remained central. Earl continued to serve on cooperative boards and participated in local fairs. He supported the FFA chapter at the high school, offering mentorship to students interested in agriculture. He volunteered during harvest time when neighbors needed help, and they reciprocated when he fell behind. These acts of solidarity were not acts of charity. They were recognition that survival depended on collective effort. When a neighbor's barn collapsed under heavy snow, Earl was there to help rebuild. When he suffered an injury during harvest, other farmers showed up with their combines to finish his fields. This reciprocity was the glue that held the rural community together. Throughout his 30s and 40s, Earl's faith remained a compass. He prayed over decisions and found comfort in scripture that spoke to perseverance and hope. Church was still a place where he felt connected, not just to his neighbors, but to something larger than himself. When tragedies struck other families, a tractor accident, a child's illness, he was there with food, with money, with tears. He knew that life on the land was precarious, and he believed that part of his purpose was to support others facing similar challenges. This sense of collective responsibility deepened as he aged. He no longer saw himself simply as a farmer. He saw himself as a custodian of a way of life. By the end of this chapter, the reader should see Earl as a man shaped by both adversity and grace. He has faced economic crises, personal loss, and shifting industry dynamics. He has embraced technology when it aligned with his values and rejected it when it threatened his autonomy. He has maintained relationships even as circumstances strained them. His life is not linear, it is cyclical, like the seasons. Each cycle brings new challenges and new opportunities. The next chapter will delve into the modern era, where climate change, globalization, and technology converge in ways that will test everything he has learned and everything he believes. Entering his 50s, Earl Mitchell found himself in a world that felt both familiar and foreign. The same barns and fields surrounded him, but the context in which he farmed had changed dramatically. Climate patterns were no longer as predictable as they once had been. The warm spells came earlier, the storms more violent, the droughts more severe. These changes were not anomalies. They were signs of a broader shift. Scientists called it climate change, and while politicians debated its causes, farmers like Earl faced its effects daily. The soil he had known his entire life was still rich, but it was also under stress from events beyond his control. One year, heavy rains delayed planting, turning fields into muddy expanses that swallowed tractors. The next year, a heat wave during pollination reduced corn yields dramatically. Another year, An early autumn frost damaged soybeans that had not yet reached maturity. Each event required adjustments, planting later, choosing varieties with different maturity rates, altering fertilizer applications. Earl kept detailed records, comparing notes with neighbors and attending university extension meetings to learn how to adapt. He installed drainage tile in low-lying fields and invested in irrigation for others. These measures cost money and time, but they were investments in the future. He understood that adaptation was necessary for survival. Globalization also influenced his choices. Markets were now affected not only by weather in Iowa, but by economic conditions in China, trade policies in Washington, and currency fluctuations in Europe. A decision made by a government thousands of miles away could impact the price he received for his crops. He became more attuned to international news, reading about tariffs and trade deals with the same attention he gave to weather forecasts. It was both fascinating and frustrating to realize that events far beyond his farm could have immediate consequences for his livelihood. At times, he felt small, as if his efforts mattered less in the face of such vast systems. Yet he also felt a sense of pride in being part of a global network of producers feeding the world. Technology accelerated at a pace that astonished him. Drones flew over fields capturing high-resolution images of crop health. Smartphones provided weather updates and market prices in real time. Tractors guided by GPS kept rows straight within centimeters. Earl adopted some of these technologies cautiously. He used satellite imagery to detect pest infestations early, saving pesticide by targeting specific areas instead of blanket spraying. He implemented variable rate fertilization, applying nutrients precisely where needed to reduce waste and protect groundwater. He kept records in digital format, allowing for more detailed analysis. Yet he remained wary of over-reliance on devices that could fail or on data that might be sold to companies with interests different from his own. Socially, rural communities continued to shrink. Young people left for colleges and careers in cities. Small towns struggled to keep schools open. Hospitals closed or merged with larger systems. The infrastructure that had once supported vibrant rural life, the feed store, the diner, the hardware store, diminished. Earl felt the impact of these changes personally. There were fewer volunteers for the fire department. Church attendance waned. The sense of collective identity that had anchored his youth was eroding. Yet in this decline, he also saw resilience. Those who remained were committed. Newcomers, drawn by the desire for a simpler life or by the opportunity to farm on a smaller scale, arrived and brought fresh energy. Earl welcomed them, recognizing that new blood was essential for the survival of the community. During these years, Earl's children returned to the farm less frequently. His daughter's research took her abroad, studying water management in arid regions. His son worked as a mechanic for heavy equipment, using the skills he developed in the farm shop to service machines on construction sites. They called and visited, but their lives were full elsewhere. Earl supported their independence, even as he felt a pang of loss. He had always said he would never pressure them to take over the farm, but facing the reality that no one might continue after him forced a shift in his perspective. He began to see the farm as something that might not remain in the family, despite his efforts. This possibility weighed heavily on him. The land was his anchor. The idea of letting it go felt like a betrayal of his father and grandfather. The first time he received an offer from a corporate entity to purchase his land, he was insulted. The letter arrived on thick paper, offering a sum far higher than any appraisal he had seen. It came from an investment firm located in another state, representing a pension fund looking to diversify into agricultural real estate. The letter praised the quality of his soil and the consistency of his yields. It promised a smooth transaction and generous terms. Earl placed the letter on the kitchen table, stared at it, and then placed it in a drawer. Over the next months, more letters arrived. Some were from corporations, others from wealthy individuals looking for farmland as an investment. Each one offered more money. Each one glossed over the fact that the buyer had no connection to the community and no intention of farming the land personally. These offers triggered a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, they represented financial security. Selling could provide a comfortable retirement, pay for medical expenses as he aged, and offer his children a legacy in the form of money rather than land. On the other hand, selling would sever a bond that had defined his identity. It would turn fields that had been tended for generations into assets managed by distant shareholders. It would contribute to the trend of consolidation that he had resisted all his life. Earl sought counsel from his pastor, his banker, and trusted friends. The advice varied. Some said to take the money, retire, travel, and enjoy the years he had left. Others urged him to hold on, arguing that some things cannot be priced. Ultimately, he declined the offers. He did so not because he believed farming would become easier or more profitable, but because he could not imagine himself without the daily rhythm of caring for the land. He felt he owed it to his ancestors who had worked tirelessly to acquire and maintain it. He also felt an obligation to his community. If he sold to a corporation, a part of the community's heart would be lost. He decided he would continue as long as he was physically able, trusting that the right path would become clear when the time came. This decision brought peace, at least temporarily. It reaffirmed his identity and clarified his purpose. The land was not just an asset. It was a calling that he could not abandon lightly. Health concerns began to intrude. Years of physical labor took their toll. Earl's knees ached during harvest. His back stiffened after long days on the tractor. He visited doctors more regularly, taking medications for high blood pressure and monitoring his cholesterol. He recognized that he could not work forever at the pace he once did. He hired help during peak seasons, relying on young neighbors who were eager for work. He taught them how to operate equipment safely, how to check for signs of compaction in the soil, how to listen to an engine and sense when something was wrong. This mentoring reminded him that knowledge must be passed on intentionally. He could not assume that anyone would absorb it by osmosis as he had from his father. The death of a close friend, another farmer, further shook him. The friend had been a year younger, seemingly healthy, yet a heart attack claimed him suddenly during harvest. This loss forced Earl to confront his mortality. He thought about what would happen to his farm if he died unexpectedly. He had a will, but he knew that legal documents alone could not convey the meaning of the land to those who would inherit it. He began writing letters to his children, not to pressure them to farm, but to explain why he had continued all these years. He described the satisfaction of watching seeds germinate, the quiet joy of walking fields after a rain, the comfort of routine tasks done well. He wanted them to understand that the farm was more than an inheritance. It was a trust. With each passing year, the tension between tradition and change intensified. Earl attended workshops on regenerative agriculture, intrigued by practices that promised to heal the soil and capture carbon. He experimented with cover crops, planting rye and clover between rows of corn to protect the soil from erosion. He implemented rotational grazing with cattle, moving them from pasture to mimic natural systems. These practices required learning and adaptation. They were not what his father had done, but they aligned with the principle of stewardship. At the same time, he continued using conventional methods where they made sense. He did not see himself as either a conventional or organic farmer. He saw himself as a steward applying the best tools available to meet the needs of his land. In reflecting on this period, Earl often thought about resilience not as bouncing back, but as adapting forward. Resilience meant recognizing when something was not working and having the courage to change. It meant balancing respect for tradition with an openness to innovation. It meant accepting that some battles, like the global forces of consolidation, were beyond his control, while others, like the health of his soil, were within his reach. The land taught him these lessons daily. He learned that the lines on the yield maps, the numbers on the balance sheet, and the rhythms of the seasons were part of a larger pattern. They informed him about what he could influence and what he needed to surrender. By the end of this chapter, the audience sees Earl facing the realities of modern farming with wisdom earned over decades. The climate is changing. The markets are volatile. Technology is both a blessing and a curse. The community is shrinking even as new people arrive. Family dynamics are shifting. Health concerns are emerging. Offers to buy the farm are tempting, but ultimately declined. In the midst of these complexities, Earl remains committed to his purpose. The next chapter will explore the near present, where global crises and personal revelations converge, pushing him to make decisions that will define his legacy. When the global pandemic reached rural Iowa, Earl Mitchell was 65. He had seen many cycles of hardship, but this one was different. It was not a drought or a flood. It was an invisible virus that transformed everyday interactions and disrupted supply chains across the world. For Earl, the initial impact was disorienting. Processing plants shut down, creating a backlog of animals ready for slaughter. Commodity prices fluctuated wildly as buyers pulled back and consumers stockpiled groceries. The farm supply store reduced hours. Church services moved online. His routine, once anchored by predictable rhythms, had to adapt to a world where nothing seemed certain. Earl felt the weight of the pandemic most acutely in the isolation it imposed. For decades, the farm had been both workplace and social hub. Neighbors would stop by to borrow equipment or share a cup of coffee. Church and community events provided regular gatherings. During the pandemic, these interactions slowed to a trickle. Earl spent long days alone in the fields, aware that his age put him at higher risk if he contracted the virus. He limited trips to town, wore a mask when he did go, and watched with mixed feelings as social media filled with arguments about restrictions. He missed the handshake deals and face-to-face conversations that had been part of his life for so long. Financially, the farm weathered the pandemic with relative stability. Earl had diversified enough that he did not depend solely on any single market. He sold some grain at a loss, but stored the rest until prices improved. He deferred equipment upgrades. He continued with conservation practices, believing that long-term soil health was non-negotiable. Government relief programs provided some support, but he was wary of becoming reliant on them. Instead, he focused on what he could control: planting, tending, and harvesting. The work itself was a source of solace. Being in the fields allowed him to forget, if only temporarily, the uncertainty outside the fence lines. The pandemic also prompted introspection. Earl had been considering retirement in a vague, distant sense, but the sudden fragility of life made the question more urgent. He thought about what it would mean to stop farming, to hand over the keys to someone else. He thought about his father, who had worked until he could not physically continue. He thought about his children and their lives far from the farm. He thought about the letters he had written and whether they would be enough to convey the meaning of the land. These reflections were not morbid. They were practical. Earl wanted to ensure that when he did decide to step back, the farm would be in a position to thrive. Around this time, a young family moved into the area, buying a small acreage that had been vacant. They had dreams of starting a market garden, raising pastured chickens, and living a life more connected to the earth. They contacted Earl for advice, and he found himself in the role of mentor again. He walked their fields with them, shared knowledge about soil testing, talked about the realities of managing a farm business. Their enthusiasm reminded him of himself decades earlier, when possibility seemed endless. Their presence also sparked hope. Perhaps there, Were people willing to invest themselves in the land even without a generational connection? Perhaps the future of small-scale agriculture was not as bleak as he sometimes feared. The young family's questions revealed to Earl how much knowledge he had accumulated. He explained how to read the clouds for signs of a storm, how to calibrate a seeder, how to decide when to cut hay based on moisture content. These tasks were second nature to him, yet they were foreign to newcomers. Passing on this knowledge felt like an obligation. He realized that if people like him did not teach, much of what he had learned would die with him. This awareness prompted him to become more intentional about mentoring. He volunteered with the local extension service. He offered to host workshops on his farm. He wrote articles for the cooperative newsletter. Sharing became as important as producing. Personal health became another focal point. Earl underwent surgery to address chronic knee pain. Recovery kept him off the tractor for weeks. During this time, he relied on neighbors and hired help to plant and spray. Watching from the porch while others worked his fields was both humbling and enlightening. He saw that the farm could continue without him, physically present at every moment. He also saw the gaps in his instructions, the details he assumed were understood, but were not. This forced absence became a rehearsal for retirement. It allowed him to see what processes needed better documentation and which relationships needed strengthening. One afternoon during his recovery, Earl sat at the kitchen table sorting through old photographs. The images spanned decades. Black and white photos of his grandparents standing with draft horses, faded color prints of his father in the 1960s leaning against a new tractor, Polaroids of Earl and his wife holding their infant daughter, digital prints of his children at their graduations. As he sorted, he felt the weight of continuity. Each photograph represented a moment in a story that was still unfolding. The land had been the backdrop for all these moments. It had witnessed laughter, tears, births, and farewells. It had changed, but it had also remained constant, anchoring lives in a common thread. Going through the photographs, Earl noticed his own aging process. The boy with bright eyes had become a man with sun-creased skin and gray hair. The energy of youth had been replaced by the steadiness of experience. He felt gratitude for the years he had been granted on the land. He also felt a sense of urgency to pass on what he knew. The future was not guaranteed, but the present was rich with opportunity to teach, to mentor, to leave a mark beyond yields and balance sheets. As recovery progressed, Earl returned to the fields gradually. He found joy in the simple act of driving a tractor down a row, watching the planter place seeds in the soil. He felt satisfaction in hearing the rhythmic click of a combine unloading grain. These familiar sounds were a balm to his soul. They grounded him in the present, reminding him that despite global crises and personal challenges, the fundamental act of farming remained the same. You prepare the soil, you plant the seed, you nurture it, you harvest, you repeat. This repetition was not monotonous. It was ritual. It provided structure and meaning. Not long after returning to full strength, Earl received another offer for his farm. This time, it came from a young farmer in the community, someone who had been renting land and wanted to expand. The offer was not as financially lucrative as the corporate offers had been, but it carried something those offers lacked: a promise to keep the land in production by someone who cared about it. Earl knew this young man. He had watched him grow from a boy in 4-H into a responsible farmer. He had seen him volunteer at community events and help neighbors. The offer sparked a new internal debate. Selling to him would preserve the land's agricultural purpose. It would not maximize financial gain, but it would align with Earl's values. He did not say yes or no immediately. Instead, he invited the young farmer over. They sat on the porch, socially distanced because of the pandemic, and talked about the land, about the young man's plans, about Earl's hopes and fears. The conversation was long and honest. Earl explained the challenges of the farm, the quirks of each field, the importance of relationships with neighbors. The young man listened carefully. He spoke about his dream to raise his children on a farm, to teach them about the soil, to contribute to the community. Earl saw in him a reflection of his younger self. He felt a stirring of possibility. This meeting did not result in an immediate decision. Earl told the young farmer he needed time to think, to consult with his children, and to pray. He did all three. He called his daughter and son, explained the offer, and asked their opinions. Both encouraged him to do what felt right. They reassured him that they did not expect to farm themselves, but supported whatever decision he made. Earl prayed for guidance, asking for clarity and the courage to act according to his values. Over the following weeks, he weighed the pros and cons, revisited his letters, looked out over his fields at sunset, and imagined a future where another family took root. By the time the world began to emerge from the initial shock of the pandemic, Earl had made up his mind. He called the young farmer and said he would like to discuss the terms of a sale or long-term lease that would allow the younger man to take over gradually. The conversation that followed was grounded in mutual respect. They agreed on a timeline that would allow Earl to mentor the young farmer for a few years, passing on knowledge while still being involved. They decided on a price that was fair, but not predatory. They shook hands, a gesture that returned after months of distance, sealing an agreement that honored tradition and embraced change. The rest of this chapter explores the transition process. Earl began drafting more detailed plans for each field, documenting the history and specific needs. He labeled equipment, shared contact information for suppliers, and introduced the young farmer to bankers and cooperative board members. He sat down with him to go through old records, explaining what had worked and what had not. He took him to the creek at the back of the property, showing where deer crossed and where the soil was prone to erosion. These moments were not grand, they were quietly significant. They represented the passing of knowledge from one generation to another, not through blood, but through shared purpose. In the background, the world continued to grapple with the pandemic's aftermath. Supply chains slowly normalized. The community resumed in-person events cautiously. Earl attended a church service in person for the first time in months. He hugged friends he had not seen except through screens. The experience underscored the fragility and importance of community connections. He realized that one reason he was ready to transition the farm was that he saw the community as strong enough to support him in a new phase of life. He could step back and still be part of something bigger than himself. As this chapter ends, the audience can sense a turning point. Earl is not leaving immediately, but he is acknowledging that the land will outlast him. He is taking steps to ensure that when his boots no longer walk these fields, someone else's will. He is acting with intention, not surrender. He is still the last farmer of his generation on that land, but he is no longer the last farmer in the story. The next chapter will delve into the emotional and logistical complexities of transition, the joy and sorrow of letting go, and the wisdom that emerges when a lifetime of experience finds a new vessel. The transition period on the farm was unlike anything Earl Mitchell had experienced before. For years, every decision had been his, every outcome his responsibility. Now he found himself sharing those decisions with someone half his age. The young farmer who would one day own the land came early each morning, notebook in hand, eager to learn everything from machinery maintenance to soil composition. Earl was struck by the intensity of the young man's questions and the humility with which he listened. He realized that he was not simply transferring ownership of property. He was entrusting a legacy built by 3 generations. That realization filled him with both pride and gravity. The tractors and combines could be replaced, but the stories, the lessons, and the values needed to be cultivated like crops. This sense of stewardship guided him as he stepped into the role of teacher. They began with the basics that were anything but simple: field rotation, timing, and the subtle art of reading weather patterns beyond what any app could predict. Earl explained how to test soil by feel, how to smell the earth after a rain to gauge its health, and how to watch the horizon for the type of clouds that signaled hail. He shared techniques for calibrating planters and setting the depth of tillage equipment based on moisture and soil structure. More importantly, he explained why he had made certain choices in years past and how each decision fit into a larger philosophy of stewardship. He emphasized that decisions must balance profit with sustainability, efficiency with ethics. The young farmer listened and took notes, occasionally looking up to ask a question that revealed he understood the deeper concepts. Earl felt a sense of relief. The land would be cared for by someone capable of grasping not just the how, but the why. As the season progressed, Earl witnessed the young farmer driving his tractor down rows that Earl had plowed 1,000 times. There was something both jarring and comforting about seeing someone else behind the wheel. It was a visual representation of the passage of time and the inevitability of change. Earl stood at the edge of a field one afternoon, leaning against a fence post, watching as the tractor disappeared and reappeared over the slight rises in the landscape. In those moments, memories of his father teaching him flooded back. He remembered the pride in his father's eyes when Earl took his first pass down a field unsupervised. Now he saw that same pride reflected in his own gaze. He realized that mentoring was a way of honoring his father, a way of ensuring that the lessons he had received did not end with him. This continuity was both an obligation and a privilege. There were also private moments of doubt. Earl would wake in the night wondering if he was giving up too soon, or if he had made the right decision in choosing this particular successor. He would walk through the farmhouse in the pre-dawn hours, hand trailing, along the wooden banister polished by decades of use, and wonder what the house would feel like without the daily rhythm of farm life. He visited his father's grave more frequently, standing quietly beneath the oak tree that had shaded it since Earl was a boy. There, he expressed gratitude for the guidance he had received and sought wisdom for the decisions he was making. He never heard a voice in reply, but he left those visits with a calmer heart. The act of acknowledging his ancestors and their sacrifices grounded him. It reminded him that letting go was part of the cycle. His father had eventually stepped aside, so would he. The presence of the new farmer's family brought unexpected joy. The young man's partner and children often came to the farm, particularly on weekends. Earl watched as children ran through the yard, laughing, their feet pounding the same paths his children had decades earlier. He smiled as small hands reached up to pet a calf or pick a dandelion, remembered the innocence of his own children when they first discovered the wonders of the farm. There was something healing in seeing the farm become a backdrop for new memories. It reassured him that the land would remain a place of growth and discovery, not just a production unit. He saw in those children the potential for a life tied to soil and seasons, should they choose that path. This possibility made his decision feel less like an ending and more like a continuation. Sharing meals became a key part of the mentoring process. After mornings spent in the fields or shop, Earl and the young farmer would sit at the kitchen table with plates of simple food. They would talk about the work just completed and the work ahead. Earl found that these conversations often drifted into stories of drought years and bumper crops, of neighbors helping each other, of mistakes made and lessons learned. He discovered that storytelling was as important as technical instruction. Through stories, he conveyed values that could not be captured in manuals: patience, humility, perseverance, and integrity. The young farmer listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes asking how those stories influenced later choices. These exchanges became a way of weaving the new farmer into the fabric of the farm's history. They also allowed Earl to reflect on his own journey and articulate what mattered most. The unpredictability of weather continued to test them, A late spring freeze threatened newly emerged corn. High winds snapped branches off trees and knocked down an old section of fence. Heavy rains washed gullies in a hillside field. Each event required swift response. Together, they assessed damage, made plans, and executed repairs. Earl guided the young farmer through the process of applying for crop insurance claims and negotiating with the local conservation district for assistance with erosion control. The challenges were frustrating, but they served as teachable moments. Earl explained that resilience was not about avoiding problems, but about responding to them effectively. He praised the young farmer for his calm demeanor and problem-solving skills. These experiences built confidence on both sides. Earl began to trust that he could step back without disaster striking. The young farmer began to trust his own judgment while still valuing Earl's advice. As the seasons moved from planting to cultivating to harvest, Earl adjusted his daily routine. He still rose early, but instead of immediately heading to the fields, he sometimes took a walk along the property line, noticing bird song and wildflowers he had overlooked when he was racing to beat the weather. He spent more time in the shop, organizing tools and writing notes for the young farmer to reference in the future. He cleaned out the attic, finding old notebooks and receipts that traced the evolution of the farm. He visited neighbors during daylight hours rather than waiting until after dark. He sat on the porch and watched sunsets without feeling guilty for not being in a tractor seat. These slower moments allowed him to observe the farm from a different perspective, one that was less tied to production and more attuned to beauty and continuity. Formalities needed attention as well. Earl scheduled meetings with his banker and lawyer to update legal documents. Together with his children, he restructured the family trust to reflect the new arrangement with the young farmer. He reviewed insurance policies, equipment titles, and conservation program contracts. He ensured that each piece of machinery was properly documented, that seed and fertilizer suppliers knew who to contact, and that the cooperative had the new farmer's information. These tasks were not glamorous, but they were essential. Earl knew from watching others that a lack of clear paperwork could undo years of careful planning. The process was tedious, but it gave him peace of mind. He could see the administrative side of the farm, taking shape in the hands of someone who cared. In quiet moments, Earl considered the broader implications of his decision. He realized that by stepping aside deliberately, he was challenging the myth that farmers must work until they collapse. He was demonstrating that planning for succession was not an admission of weakness, but an act of strength. He was affirming that the land's welfare was more important than his pride. He also recognized that his identity could expand beyond daily farm work. He could be a mentor, a community advocate, and a storyteller. He could share his experiences with audiences beyond the county line, perhaps even through platforms like this one. Letting go did not diminish him. It allowed him to grow in new directions. This perspective did not erase the sadness of transition, but it infused it with purpose. By the close of this chapter, the viewer understands that the transfer of a family farm is both practical and deeply emotional. It requires technical instruction, legal arrangements, and financial planning. It also requires the humble sharing of stories and the openness to feel both grief and hope. Earl's journey in mentoring his successor reflects the essence of resilience. He does not cling to the past. He does not abandon the future. He walks a path that honors what has been while trusting in what will be. The next chapter will explore how Earl's world expands as he gradually steps away from daily farm operations and discovers new roles and experiences beyond the fields he has tended for a lifetime. Stepping back from daily farm operations did not mean stepping away from purpose. As Earl Mitchell reduced his hours in the tractor and handed over responsibilities to the younger farmer, he confronted a vast landscape of time he had never known as an adult. At first, the empty spaces on his calendar felt unsettling. He would wake up before dawn out of habit, only to remember that he did not need to be in a field by sunrise. The quiet of his home, without the constant hum of machinery or the need to monitor weather patterns, was both comforting and disorienting. Earl realized that he needed to redefine what productivity meant outside the context of planting and harvesting. This was not retirement in the sense of idleness. It was a transition to a different form of engagement with the world. One of the first things Earl did with his newfound time was reconnect with his daughter on a deeper level. She had built a career studying water management in arid regions, and her research often took her to places far from Iowa. For years, their conversations had been quick phone calls between chores or updates over holiday dinners. Now, Earl had the flexibility to travel. He visited her field site in New Mexico, where she was working on a project involving irrigation systems and community water rights. Standing under a blazing sun, watching water trickle through channels in a desert valley, Earl saw parallels between the farmers there and those in his own community. The challenges were different, but the stakes were the same. People were working to sustain themselves in harmony with their environment. This trip expanded his understanding of agriculture. He returned home with a broader perspective and a deeper appreciation for his daughter's work. Earl also found himself drawn to activities he had once enjoyed but neglected due to time constraints. He dusted off his guitar, an instrument he had played during his youth but rarely touched since. Sitting on his porch in the evenings, he strummed chords and relearned melodies. Music became another way to connect with his community. He joined a group of local musicians who met weekly at the town's community center. They played folk songs, hymns, and even some modern tunes. Through music, he forged new friendships and rediscovered a creative outlet that filled his heart. The rhythm of the songs reminded him of the rhythm of the seasons, and he found comfort in the familiar pattern of chord progressions. Volunteering became another focus. Earl's lifelong involvement in community organizations provided a foundation, but with more time, he took on larger roles. He became a mentor through the local school's agricultural program, guiding students in science fair projects and FFA competitions. He worked with the Conservation District to promote soil health initiatives, sharing his experiences with regenerative practices. He assisted at the food pantry, stocking shelves and distributing produce donated by local farmers. In each setting, he found ways to contribute without dominating, offering guidance while allowing others to lead. This shift from doing to supporting required humility, but it also brought a different kind of satisfaction. He saw tangible results in the growth of young people and the strengthening of community services. Travel extended beyond his daughter's field site. Earl visited national parks, something he had always wanted to do, but never had time for. Walking through old-growth forests, hiking along mountain trails, and standing at the rim of the Grand Canyon, he marveled at the landscapes vastly different from the Iowa fields he knew so intimately. These trips were not just leisure. They were lessons in perspective. Observing ecosystems where farming was impossible reminded him of the diversity of the world and the variety of ways people adapted to their environments. He collected small stones from each place he visited, labeling them with a date and location. Back home, he placed them on a windowsill, a physical reminder that while his roots were deep, his branches could spread widely. The passing of time brought changes in his personal life as well. Earl reconnected with an old friend from high school who had moved back to the area after a career in nursing. They began attending community events together, sharing meals and taking walks. Their companionship eased the loneliness that had settled in after his divorce and the emptying of his nest. It was not a replacement for his marriage, but a new chapter of companionship grounded in shared history and mutual respect. Earl appreciated having someone who understood the rhythms of rural life and who valued community as he did. Their relationship was gentle, unhurried, and based on a sense of companionship rather than urgency. Even as he explored these new avenues, Earl remained connected to the farm. He still attended cooperative meetings and kept up with market news. He still walked the fields, though now it was often with the young farmer, discussing observations rather than making decisions. He would sit in the passenger seat of the tractor occasionally, enjoying the ride without feeling the pressure to reach a certain number of acres before dark. In these moments, he felt gratitude for the opportunity to witness the land continue to thrive. He saw that the soil did not require his hands alone to remain productive. It required hands guided by respect and knowledge, and those were present. Earl also began to share his story with a wider audience. The invitation from a local librarian to speak at a program on community history turned into a series of talks. He spoke at the library, the high school, and a regional agriculture conference. In these talks, he emphasized that resilience was not a solo act. It depended on relationships, integrity, and adaptability. He told the story of his father, the farm crisis, the separation from his wife, and the pandemic. He described the decision to partner with a young farmer and the emotions involved. Listeners responded. Some thanked him for his honesty. Others shared their own stories of struggle and perseverance. These interactions reinforced his sense that storytelling was a form of service. Not every day was filled with grand discoveries. There were mornings when Earl simply read the newspaper, drank coffee, and watched birds at the feeder. There were afternoons spent weeding his garden or repairing a loose fence board. These mundane tasks, once part of a larger routine of necessity, became acts of mindfulness. He found pleasure in doing a job slowly and well, without the ticking clock of planting deadlines. He noticed details he had missed when his focus had been fixed on yield and efficiency. He learned to appreciate stillness, to let moments linger. This was perhaps the greatest challenge and gift of his new phase, learning that being still could be as valuable as being busy. By engaging in these diverse activities, travel, music, volunteering, companionship, Earl discovered that his identity was more than the sum of acres plowed or bushels harvested. He was a father, a mentor, a musician, a traveler, a friend, and a citizen. Farming had shaped him, but it did not wholly define him. Realizing this allowed him to let go of the farm with grace. It also enabled him to bring the wisdom gained from farming into new contexts. Whether he was advising a teenager on soil science or playing guitar at a senior center, the values of patience, resilience, and integrity infused his actions. The next chapter will bring us to the culmination of Earl's transition, the last harvest he will lead, a moment both ceremonial and practical, rich with emotion and meaning for everyone involved. The last harvest on the Mitchell farm did not begin with fanfare, but it carried a ceremony all its own. The grain was ready, the days were crisp, and the weather forecasts promised just enough dry time to bring in the crop. Earl woke before dawn out of habit and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The stars were still visible, and the horizon held the first hints of light. He thought about the thousands of mornings he had started like this, and about how this one was different. It would be the last time he would be the one to decide when the machines rolled. The young farmer arrived with his family. Neighbors pulled into the yard with grain trucks, and his children emerged from cars with sleepy smiles. The gathering felt like a reunion and a rite of passage. Without speeches or declarations, everyone understood that this harvest was a turning point. The sense of community filled the air as surely as the scent of diesel fuel and earth. Earl took a deep breath, grateful for the chance to begin once more. In the fields, the work unfolded with the familiar rhythm Earl had known his entire life, yet each action carried an undercurrent of awareness. He climbed into the combine and eased it into the first row, feeling the machine's response to the slight incline and the moisture level of the stalks. The young farmer sat beside him, watching, asking about adjustments, absorbing the nuance of engine sounds and the visual cues that signaled when to speed up or slow down. Earl spoke not as a boss, but as a mentor. explaining why he altered settings based on plant height and soil type, why he watched the color of the chaff to gauge threshing efficiency, and why he paused to clear residue before continuing. As the header cut through the rows, he thought of his father doing the same and of his children riding on a similar buddy seat years ago. He felt a wave of gratitude that he could teach one more time from the driver's seat before handing it over completely. The crops flowed into the bin, each kernel a testament to years of experience and care. Midway through the day, they paused for a meal, a tradition that transcended generations. Trucks were parked in a semicircle near the field edge, and tables appeared with platters of sandwiches, thermoses of soup, and pie baked by neighbors. Laughter rose as people told stories of harvests past, of tractors stuck in mud until half the town showed up to pull them out, of equipment breakdowns that required creative fixes, and of yields so abundant that grain bins overflowed. Earl listened and added his own memories, watching the young farmer's children sit cross-legged on tailgates, their mouths full of apple slices and curiosity. He realized that these meals were as important as the hours spent in the fields. They reinforced bonds, reminded everyone that the work was communal, and provided space to honor the labor that went into each crop. When the break ended and engines roared to life again, there was an unspoken sense of gratitude that nourished more than the body. It nourished the soul. As evening approached, the orange glow of the setting sun cast long shadows across the harvested rows, turning the stubble into a carpet of gold. Earl switched seats with the young farmer, moving to the passenger side as his protege took the controls. He watched the steady hands on the steering wheel and the attentive eyes scanning monitors and gauges. A sense of peace settled over him. This was the culmination of months of preparation and decades of labor. He felt a pang of sadness, knowing that he would miss the rush of harvest, the adrenaline of racing a storm and the satisfaction of unloading a hopper of grain. Yet that sadness was tempered by contentment. He had shepherded the crop from seed to bin one last time, and he had guided someone else to continue the work. When they finished the final pass and parked the combine, the group gathered to mark the moment. There were no tears, no dramatic words, only handshakes and hugs and a shared understanding that an era had ended and a new one had begun. In the weeks that followed, as frost covered the stubble and geese flew south overhead, Earl settled into quieter rhythms. Without the urgency of daily farm tasks, he had space to think deeply about what it all meant. He reread the letters he had written to his children, tweaking them to include insights gleaned from the final harvest. He wrote new notes for the young farmer, detailing observations about specific fields and suggestions for future rotations. He walked along the creek, noticing how the banks had changed over the years and how cover crops had stabilized the soil. He reflected on the lessons his life had taught him: resilience as adaptation rather than stubbornness, integrity as a compass rather than a constraint, community as the true safety net, humility as the key to growth, and faith as the anchor in storms. He understood that these values transcended farming. They were applicable to any endeavor. By articulating them, he hoped to make sense of his journey and to offer guidance to those who might read or hear his story. Earl also thought about the ways his story might be misunderstood. He worried that some might romanticize his life as a pastoral idyll, free of complication, or think of farming as an antiquated pursuit with no place in modern society. He wanted people to know that farming was both beautiful and brutal, rewarding and risky. It demanded constant vigilance, a tolerance for uncertainty, and a willingness to work when others slept. It tested marriages, strained finances, and sometimes broke spirits. Yet it also provided deep fulfillment, a connection to natural cycles, and a tangible sense of purpose. Earl hoped that by sharing both joys and hardships, he could paint an honest picture that honored farmers without glossing over the costs. He believed that honesty fostered respect, and respect fostered support for policies and practices that sustain family farms and the land itself. When he envisioned the audience for his story, Earl saw people from all walks of life. He saw urban professionals, suburban parents, students, retirees, and fellow farmers. He saw individuals who might never set foot in a field yet depended on what came from it. He addressed them directly in his mind, inviting them to see the connection between their plates and his furrows. He encouraged them to support local agriculture by buying produce from farmers' markets, by choosing foods grown with care, and by asking questions about origins. He urged them to advocate for soil health, fair labor practices, and fair prices. He reminded them that every meal was a vote for the kind of food system they wanted. In doing so, he hoped to inspire not guilt, but agency. People could make choices that supported resilience and sustainability, and those choices mattered. Finally, Earl turned his thoughts to legacy. He understood that stories like his held power when they were shared and embraced. He imagined viewers leaving comments about where they were watching from, about their own connections to farms or lack thereof, and about the values that resonated with them. He pictured them subscribing not just out of curiosity, but out of commitment to a mission, to honor the backbone of America and to keep the heartland alive. He knew that the last farmer was more than a channel. It was a community built on respect for hard work, tradition, and the dignity of honest labor. By inviting others to join, he was extending the chain of stewardship beyond his fields. As he concluded his reflections, he pictured himself once again on his porch at dawn, coffee in hand, looking over land he had tended for a lifetime. The mist rising over the soil seemed like a benediction. He whispered a silent prayer of gratitude and sent his story out into the world, trusting that it would plant seeds of appreciation and responsibility in hearts far and wide. Your awareness and support nurture farmers and connect choices to survival.